So what we're going to talk from now on could probably be classified as productivity techniques, but the bones of these techniques are all of these concepts that we've talked about over the last couple sections, the human mind and how things work. The first, we've already alluded to, it's called the fivefold why. So this is the process of, remember we were talking about states of being that look like goals, and asking yourself, why do I want this? The fivefold why can actually be generalized to pretty much anything. And it's a technique to basically help you find what you actually want. So whenever you think you want something, or you think something needs to be done in a certain way, it's very simple. You ask yourself, why? And when you get an answer, you ask yourself, why again? And you keep asking yourself why until you get to the point where it's just because. So I want this thing because I want it. And when you reach that point, it's probably a state of being if you're doing the goal technique. If you're trying to figure out why something has to happen the way it needs to happen, once you reach the point is because there's no other way to do it, you have found the root cause of that. And the reason it's called the fivefold why is it can go more or less, but it usually goes about 5 levels deep. So you keep asking yourself why and why and why at least 5 times until you get to the point where it becomes self-referential. And at that point, this is often called root cause analysis. You're trying to get to the root of why things have to be the way that they are.
The fivefold why. Questions for reflection. Look at your current goals. Are they ends in themselves, or could there be deeper reasons behind your desires? How can you use the fivefold why technique to discover the root causes behind your goals?
Now, once you get there, you can use a technique that I call the fivefold how, which is once you get to the root cause of something or the root reason why you want a certain thing, you do the same thing in reverse with a different question, which is, how am I going to do that? And how am I going to do that? And how am I going to do that? And how am I going to do that? So it's really interesting when you're looking at goals, if you ask yourself why and why and why and why and why until you get to the root cause, then you start asking yourself how and how and how and how and how. That's how you get from a goal to an action plan. A list of things that need to be done in order to get to this place where you want to go. So the fivefold why, going to the root cause, plus the fivefold how on establishing the list of things that need to be done to get there, is how you connect the things on your to-do list to the things that you say that you want to do. And when that connection is in place, every single thing that you get done in a given day is going to ultimately lead to that thing that you want.
The fivefold how. Questions for reflection. What's necessary to achieve your desired end state? Can you break the major parts down into small, immediate actions?
Now, that leads us to a concept that was popularized by David Allen in Getting Things Done. That's called a next action. So a next action is the very next specific concrete thing you can do right now to move a particular project forward or to move toward a particular goal. And this happens a lot if your goals are ambitious ones, is you may not know the entire plan, the entire sequence of actions between where you are right now and where you want to be. But it's good you know where you want to be because of the mental simulation thing we talked about earlier. GPS can't give you directions until you have a destination. So having the destination is step one. What the next action is designed to do is help you take a step forward to that destination without having to have the whole plan in front of you. You just need to know what the next logical step looks like. So when you're keeping a to-do list on all of these things, that's all you really know, the next action you need to take to make progress. If you know the next action, if you take the next action, you will have more information that allows you to figure out the next action and you keep moving forward there. So that's what you should focus on. Figure out the next action, focus on that, do it, take the next step. And just keep doing it and doing it and doing it until it's done.
Next action. Questions for reflection. Make a list. What projects are you currently working on? For every project on your list, what's the very next action you could take right now that would move the project forward?
Another technique, which we've already alluded to several times previously, but let's define it now. Externalization is the process of taking something that's rattling around in our brain and making it external to ourselves, to put it out into the world in some way, shape, or form. And the most common way of doing this is either writing it down, putting it down on paper, or a diagram or some other visual format, or talking it through to somebody, verbalizing the things that are in our head. And the reason externalization is particularly important, going back to the human biology and perception topics we talked about earlier, we respond better to stimuli that exist in our environment than we do the thoughts rattling around in our head. Because our brains and our bodies are optimized to see things and respond to things in the environment around us. Our minds aren't optimized to take a thought bouncing around in our frontal lobes and directly translate that into all the actions that need to happen based on that thought. It's far more effective to take that thought, make it external first, and then let our body do what it was designed to do, which is see something in the environment and respond to it. So externalization is really a neat technique, because if you've ever had the experience of having this problem that was really weighing on you, and you call up a friend or go for a walk with a friend, and you start talking, and your friend doesn't really say much. They just keep walking, or they're on the phone with you, and you keep talking and talking and talking and talking. And then you solve the problem. You tell your friend, thanks, that was really helpful, and your friend did nothing. That's an example of verbal externalization. The process of verbalizing those thoughts, putting them out into the world, helped different parts of your mind act on it that couldn't act on it before. You can do the same thing by journaling. A lot of people use a journal as a problem-solving technique or a planning tool. The reason it works is you're taking all of these thoughts, you're putting it on paper, and then different parts of your mind can act on it in ways that you couldn't act on it before. So the moral of externalization, there are all sorts of different ways to do it. Writing and talking are the two most popular. But don't keep your thoughts locked up in your head all the time. The sooner you can get it down onto paper or talk it through with somebody else, the faster you'll be able to actually use that information to get to where you want to go.
Externalization. Questions for reflection. How often do you externalize your thoughts by writing, drawing, or discussing your ideas with others? What could you do to make externalization a daily habit?
Now, there's a particular technique that works really well, works hand in hand with externalization, which is a technique called self-elicitation. And self-elicitation means asking yourself questions and then answering the questions that you ask yourself. There is a really wonderful book that I read recently called Accidental Genius by Mark Levy, which talks about a process that he calls free writing, which is basically sitting down every day with a journal or a typewriter or whatever. And if you're writing, the goal is not to sit down and be brilliant. The goal is to sit down and just to write for 20 minutes nonstop. And if you get stuck, you can either just say, I have no idea what I'm writing, I am writing now, I am just writing until I think of something. You just go on and on and on. But your goal is for your hand or fingers to be in constant motion for 20 minutes. And one of the best ways to get out of the block that he recommends is when you get stuck, just ask yourself a question. Like, what do I mean by this? Or how would I go about doing that? There are hundreds and thousands of questions that you can ask yourself to help your mind overcome a block or something that it's getting stuck on. Just ask yourself a question. I have a list of these questions to improve your results on personalmba.com. And I created that list to help me through a lot of the problems that I was facing at the time that I wrote it, which is, how do I do this? Am I getting enough exercise? Am I doing all of these things that are important to me? And just by asking the question and sitting down and answering it, you start to solve a lot of your own problems. It's a practice of self-coaching or self-consulting. Because really, a great coach or a great consultant is going to ask you a lot of questions. The value of a coach or a consultant is asking good questions and then being a person to externalize to, and most of the time you solve your own problems. So self-elicitation as a practice and externalization as a practice are two things that, of all of the habits that you can install for your own productivity and general life satisfaction, they're two of the most effective. So if you don't already have one, get a journal, Buy some journaling software if you prefer to work on the computer. It doesn't matter how you do it. But making it a practice to externalize your thoughts and ask yourself questions and answer those questions. And you make a lot of progress and overcome a lot of blockages in a very short period of time. And it's very simple, it's not complicated. And people have different preferences. So Kelsey, my wife, externalizes verbally. So I play that role for her. She talks through what she's dealing with, and I may ask a question or make a small suggestion here or there. But by and large, she is thinking through a problem by talking about it. I personally externalize best in writing. So a lot of actually how this entire program started was I was learning all of these things, and the process of me thinking through it, I had to write it down. And once I had it externalized, I could start sorting it, and I could start seeing where things overlapped and what order to put things, and as a result, the personal MBA course exists. But my way of thinking through all of these things was writing it down. So even now, if I have a problem, my first impulse is to ask myself a question and journal about it or type about it, and just do that for a while as a way of chewing the issue over. And by the end of that, I usually have either a next action, something that I'm going to try, or a question that I need to answer or go get more information about. But yes, we all need to have a way of thinking through things, and some combination of externalization and self-elicitation is the fastest way to get there. If it's something that isn't very well formed yet, I'll usually write. Just because from a structural standpoint, if I'm not at my computer, I can't get distracted. When it's something that's going into a little bit more of a finished form, that's when I start typing.
Self-elicitation. Questions for reflection. Do you consistently ask yourself useful questions? What questions can you ask yourself on a regular basis to ensure you're on track?
Now, counterfactual simulation is one of the most, and I say this completely without hyperbole, it is the most useful technique that we have at our disposal when it comes to actually accomplishing the things that we want to accomplish. This is one of the most powerful capabilities our mind has, period. And we alluded to it a little bit in our discussion of mental simulation. So our brains are built to recognize patterns in the environment, to store it in memory, and to use those patterns as a database to help us predict the future, which we're trying to do constantly and automatically. We do very quickly and very accurately. Counterfactual simulation is a technique that you can use to consciously harness this part of your brain to run the programs or run the simulations that you want it to run. So it's kind of taking this part of your brain off of autopilot, sitting at the controls and steering it in the direction that you want to go. And it's basically a process of using your imagination for a purpose. And here's how it works. You consciously ask yourself a what if or what would happen if question. And that's where the term counterfactual comes from. That's a grammatical term for a what if, a counterfactual. So you ask yourself, what if I was living on Mars next year? So it doesn't have to be connected to any of the facts at all. You can ask your brain any question you want without limitation. And the cool thing about this technique is you just supply your brain a question phrased in this format, and you let your imagination do what it was designed to do. And when you start doing this consciously, it's amazing how many things your brain just starts spitting out, even if it's something you've never thought about before, or even if it's something that you don't consider possible at all. Most of the science fiction and fantasy novels, the great novelists are the ones who actually do this the best. They ask an interesting question, like what would the world look like if, fill in the blank, and they write novels of hundreds of thousands of pages looking at what the world would look like if those things actually were true. And assuming that the thing that you're looking at is already true is a part of this technique. So counterfactual simulation does not look like, is it possible to fill in the blank? Because then your mind just does a quick mental simulation and says, nope, and it doesn't give you any further information. So part of the technique is asking the what if question, assuming it's definitely true, and then your mind starts trying to predict what else would have to be true, what else you would see in order to make that thing true. This is particularly useful for a lot of those goals that you might have where you know you want it, you know it's important, but you honestly have no idea how to get there. For me, this was wanting to leave my corporate job and wanting to start my own business, but not really thinking that that was a possible thing. It's like, oh yeah, that would be really nice to do a couple years from now. And a couple years would go by and it would still be a nice thing to do a couple years from now, right? The first time I actually did this consciously knowing what the technique was, and it was on a plane about a third of the way between San Francisco and New York LaGuardia Airport. And I asked myself the question, what would have to be true, or what would it look like if I resigned my corporate position by my birthday, which at that point was about 4 months away. And it's like, okay, I don't think this is possible, but I'm just going to start sketching out. So asked myself the question. I actually had a notebook, and I just started writing. It's like, okay, if this is going to be true, I'm going to have to make a certain amount of income, and I have a couple things that I'm trying to sell, so I would have to set these prices, and I'd have to sell this much, and I'd have to have this number of recurring clients. And you see how the questions start to cascade into other things. And by the time I landed at New York LaGuardia, not only had I found that it was indeed possible for me to quit my job and start my own business, it was possible for me to do it now, not a couple years from now, like right now. But I didn't see that it was possible because I just assumed that it wasn't. It was the reverse of a priming effect. I thought it wasn't possible, so I just didn't even think about it. And so I was traveling over the weekend. I landed on Saturday. On Monday morning, I handed in my resignation. And my last day of work in a corporate job was 3 days before my 26th birthday. And it was all because I asked myself a question on an airplane and just followed the line of thought. So the really cool thing about this technique is its flexibility. You can ask a question about anything. It doesn't matter what it is or how unrealistic it is. Just by asking yourself the question and putting to work this hugely powerful capability your mind has and doing it on a regular basis, you can find all sorts of cool things that you never noticed or appreciated before. So this is also, along with the self-elicitation, along with the externalization, making a habit, setting aside some time at a minimum every week to sit down and think about questions like this. It's one of those things that Stephen Covey in the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People would call important but not urgent. This is never going to be the alarm bell going off. But the time you spend doing stuff like this is going to lead to the most important results that you are ever going to produce. It's going to start with a question. So if that's true, the very best thing that you can do every day or every week is carve out just a little time, even just something like a half an hour in the morning or around lunch or in the evening when things are quiet, you have some time to think, just ask yourself a question and see where it goes. Then it'll be some of the best time that you ever spent.
Counterfactual simulation. Questions for reflection. How often do you dedicate time to deliberately imagining possible futures? When can you set aside dedicated time for counterfactual simulation?
Now, there's a really cool thing that goes along with this, and this is called Parkinson's Law. Cyril Northcote Parkinson, who is a British naval historian, wrote a very surprisingly hilarious management book that was called Parkinson's Law. And because Parkinson worked in the British Civil Service, saw a lot of inefficiencies in that structure. And he formulated Parkinson's Law: work expands so as to fill the time available for its completion. So if you have a project and you think that project is going to take a year, it's going to take a year. If you think it's going to take a day, it's going to take a day. If you have an hour to do it, it'll be done in an hour. So started as kind of a cynical view of working in a large, inefficient organization, but used as a counterfactual, used as a, what would it look like for me to get this project done in a week? Where getting it done in a week feels like a very aggressive thing, or getting it done in a day or done in an hour feels like a very aggressive timeline. If you artificially constrain the time that you have to do something, you'll be surprised at how much you can get done in a very small fraction of the time you think it will take. So the key is, and this is, again, one of those things that requires a balance, You can't use Parkinson's law to set a completely unreasonable deadline. So the famous adage, 9 women can't have a baby in a month. There are some things that have to go in order that just take time. But there are other things, particularly where the timeline is flexible, and you can choose to prioritize some things over others. If you artificially set yourself a very short deadline, you can get a lot of work done in a very short period of time. It's setting yourself an artificial constraint and then asking yourself the counterfactual, what would have to be true for me to get this done under this constraint? So it's a very useful way to help you find the shortest possible path to something that's important. And you just do that by setting an artificial constraint for yourself. Super useful.
Parkinson's law. Questions for reflection. Are there any areas of your life that are open-ended without any sort of limitation? How can you use Parkinson's law to set a productive artificial deadline to increase your productivity?
Now, another way of using a counterfactual or using your mental simulation capabilities, this ties into our conversation of threat lockdown earlier, which is a doomsday scenario. So a doomsday scenario is a counterfactual where you ask the question, what's the absolute worst that could happen? What if everything goes wrong? What if everything blows up? What happens then? Many times, if a situation is something we don't have a lot of experience with, is something that we're a little hesitant about, or we have other patterns that we haven't necessarily reinterpreted yet, feels very overwhelming just because it's unknown. And this is one of those things where your brain can start seeing tigers where tigers may not actually exist. So consciously asking yourself the doomsday scenario question, what's the worst that could happen? Everything goes wrong, Mr. Murphy of Murphy's Law shows up, and anything that can go wrong will. What happens? And the emotional answer to this, the threat lockdown response, is everything is going to go wrong, and then I'm going to die, I am going to be permanently shamed, nobody is going to love me, I am going to live in a van down by the river. I mean, like, your brain just blows it up out of proportion. By asking yourself the question and actually going through the simulation, you start to really imagine what would happen if all of these bad things come true. And 99 times out of 100, when you're done with the simulation, it's going to be like, well, that's not so bad. I can handle that. Or if there really are bad things that could happen, it's like, well, I could do something to prevent that. Or if that happens, I can take some actions to make that thing not as bad. But it really takes asking the conscious question and consciously going through the simulation to talk yourself down from that. So when I am coaching or consulting with someone and they are freaking out about something, this is the technique that I use. Everything goes wrong. What happens? And the vast majority of the time, the answer is nothing. Or what does happen is completely manageable or preventable.
Doomsday scenario. Questions for reflection. Imagine your doomsday scenario. What happens? What can you do to prevent that thing from happening or mitigate the impact if it occurs?
Another couple things, and then we'll start getting into working with others, which is equally as fun. Excessive self-regard tendency is the natural tendency to overestimate your own abilities. So you can think of excessive self-regard tendency as an optimism bias. We tend to overestimate, for most things, how easy something is going to be, how risky something is actually going to be, and how well we are going to be able to handle something that's wrong. Which sounds like an interesting counterpoint to the doomsday scenario, right? We assume everything's going to go wrong, and then we have a bias to be optimistic about stuff. There's an interesting counterplay between the two, which is this optimism bias, believing in our ability to get things done when we don't have a whole lot of information about it, really helped us to survive and thrive over the past several centuries. Because being risk-taking enough, or usually not having enough information to realize how low of a probability of something happening working, is enough to get us started. When we get started, we have more information, and we see the path forward, and lo and behold, we succeed at something even though the odds are astronomical that we are not going to. So there's a really good part of being very confident in our skills and abilities and just jumping in and trying things. That's why it exists. Now, on the other hand, this bias is a path to making some incredibly stupid decisions, particularly if you don't know enough about the area in which you're working. There was a quote by Steve Wozniak, who is one of the co-founders of Apple. He made the first personal computer. He said, when I got started, I had no idea how to make a computer. No clue. I knew I wanted to make one. I knew kind of one of the things that I could probably do to get started, and so I just did. And now what, by market capitalization, Apple is the largest company in the world. Started with a guy who had no clue what he was doing. Two guys who didn't know what they were doing, right? But by getting started, it allowed them to do this thing. Now, excessive self-regard tendency can get you into a lot of trouble. So remember our conversation of leverage, of taking an investment and borrowing a lot of money and multiplying your potential opportunity for gain. It actually happens once every couple decades, where speculators will be very confident in their ability to predict how the future is going to go. They'll take enormous risks that oftentimes they don't completely understand. And then when things go south, they're in a very bad situation and they didn't even know it. So excessive self-regard tendency is one of those checks that helps to correct for yourself. Also helps to have people in your life who aren't afraid to call you when you're doing something you may not understand or may not be a good idea. Having consultants or advisors or buffers in certain areas are very valuable because they can help you keep this excessive self-regard tendency in check. So one of the things, when I decided to write my book, I was friends with a couple of people who had written books in the past. And me, it's like, I have this great outline of things I've been thinking about for a long time. Like, yeah, no problem. I'm going to sit down. I'm going to bang this thing out in a couple months. It's going to be great. So I was in the middle of a contract negotiation with a hard deadline on it. And the question is, how much time contractually do I give myself to deliver on this thing? And I was just trying to say, I got this. Parkinson's law, I'm going to give myself a couple months. It's going to be great. And all of my author friends were good enough friends to tell me, you have never written a book before. They say any less than 12 months for your first book, or you are going to shoot yourself in the foot in a really horrible way. And I'm really glad I listened to them, because it took about 6 months of solid work just to get the structure of the book right. And I went through 8 or 9 rewrites of the entire structure of the book just to get to the point where I could be productive in the writing process. Because I didn't know enough when I was signing the contract to know that it was going to take that long just to get to a point where I could be productive. So that is the value of advisors and the value of more than a little bit of personal humility to say, if I don't have experience in an area, I need to collect more information or potentially make some bad decisions. And you can say, okay, what are the areas I don't know about right now? How can I find out more about them? And how much more do I need to know? What are all of the things that I perceive as potential risks? Can I get more information about how risky they are from other people who know better than me? But then, knowing all of that, it's like, I decide to do this anyway. The risks are acceptable. I'm going to move forward. And if I need to protect myself against something catastrophic happening, how can I make those decisions up front and then just stop worrying about them and just go? In actuality, it feels like more work than it actually is. Because this kind of goes into our threat lockdown thing. We're dealing with things that may be threats to us, right? Feels big, feels scary, don't necessarily want to look over there. So by spending a little time and energy up front, there were a bunch of things in my coaching and consulting business where the threat part of my brain says, what if I do something or make a suggestion and my client does it and it blows up like a $10 million company? Like, that felt very risky for me. Like, how can I be confident in the advice that I'm giving if somebody takes it and it doesn't work out? There are things that can be done to help alleviate the risk of that. One particular thing is called errors and omissions and professional liability insurance. And so it's like, okay, I'm afraid of this thing happening. There is a non-zero percentage risk of this thing at some order of magnitude happening. And there's an action that I can take right now to alleviate that risk. So I made the decision, I pay my insurance premium every month, and I don't have to think about it anymore. So it's that kind of thing that can really help you look at the monsters in the closet and do what you can to get them out of the way so you can just focus on getting things done. That's the whole goal.
Excessive self-regard tendency. Questions for reflection. What checks and balances have you placed on your own self-confidence? Do you have trusted, experienced advisors or colleagues who can prevent you from making mistakes of ignorance or hubris?
So a couple of more biases, cognitive biases that humans have, similar to excessive self-regard tendency. The first is what's called confirmation bias. And confirmation bias is the tendency for people to look for information that supports the conclusions they've already made and ignore information that might prove them wrong. And the stronger the opinion that we hold, the more we tend to ignore sources of information that challenge that opinion. Politics. Happens all the time. People who have one set of political beliefs tend to follow sources of information that agree with those political beliefs and tend to ignore sources of information that disagree with those beliefs. Even though, from a learning standpoint, you would learn more and be challenged more and probably have more accurate opinions of how the world works if you do the exact opposite. So the way to counter confirmation bias is to do exactly that. It's to consciously choose to look for sources of information that don't tell you you're right, they tell you you are wrong, or you are missing something, or you haven't thought through things in a complete manner. It's uncomfortable. It really is, because I don't know anyone on the face of the earth that loves to be wrong. But in terms of making good decisions, the information you need to look for first is if you're wrong or that you're wrong. And sometimes the information that you find changes your mind. And that's the value of it. Kelsey and I, for 3 years, as I mentioned earlier in Guiding Structure, Changing Your Habits, Kelsey and I were vegan for 3 years until we read a really excellent book by Lierre Keith called The Vegetarian Myth. And in that, Lierre Keith presents a lot of disconfirming evidence targeted to a vegetarian vegan audience about all of the drawbacks and all of the ways in which this particular lifestyle may not be as optimal as you think. And as a result of reading that book, and it was an uncomfortable book to read at that point in time in our lives, we changed our mind and we changed our behavior. And there are a lot of people who have a similar lifestyle who would refuse to read the book or have other information from other sources that contradicts or clarifies or provides more insight to it. All of your beliefs, if you want to make sure that your beliefs accurately describe how the world around you works, which is kind of the purpose of having beliefs in the first place, if that is your goal, every source of accurate information that you can get, regardless of whether it agrees or disagrees with your position, is a benefit to you, not a threat. So the practice of looking consciously for disconfirming evidence is a way of counteracting the bias of us not being naturally inclined to seek that information out. So we can choose in advance to find things. So one of the things that Warren Buffett and his partner Charlie Munger do on investments is when they're evaluating an investment, one of the first things they look for is information that tells them it's a bad investment, not a good one. And if they search as hard as they can for really good reasons why not to buy this company and they can't find very many, that's actually a very strong positive signal to buy it. But if they decided to buy the company and look for all sorts of reasons why they should buy the company, they will always find that information. Remember, all of these things are here for a reason. And the reason is because they served us very well in our ancestral environment. They're the reason we're here today. These are the places in our psychology where our modern environment has changed, but our biology and psychology have not. So it's easy to look at these as flaws in our psyche. That's not completely accurate. It's just more of a tendency that we have and will continue to have that we can notice and correct for, given the change in our environment. And on the diet thing, there are things that I do now or know about now or I value now because Kelsey and I were vegan a couple years, even though we don't follow the same strict dietary pattern now. It's the having experiences that teach you things. The value is picking up the things that are good and keeping the things that are good and accurate that describe the world around you, and then moving away from the things that don't serve you in that way. And my diet is several times more healthy now than it was before we went through that experience, and that's why.
You may not have been where you are now had you not done that.
Confirmation bias. Questions for reflection. How much time are you spending seeking evidence that you're right versus finding evidence that you're wrong? When you come across disconfirming evidence, how seriously do you consider it?
So, okay, another cognitive bias that we all suffer from to a greater or lesser extent is called hindsight bias. And hindsight bias is the tendency to kick yourself for things that you quote unquote should have known. Right? I should have known that wasn't going to work. I should have known that person was a bad person to hire. I should have known I was going to lose money on that investment. I should have known, I should have known, I should have known. The truth is, at the time you made the decision, you didn't know. You couldn't know. Because if you did, you wouldn't have made the decision that you made. So if you knew then what you know now, you wouldn't have done what you did. But when something goes poorly, we just feel stupid. Because now we have more information about how things actually turned out, and the mental simulation parts of our brain can imagine a plausible world in which we didn't suffer this misfortune that we have. So it's important to understand that hindsight bias becomes very destructive when you're constantly judging the decisions that you've made in the past. And the truth of the matter is, the decisions that you've made in the past are done. You can't go back, you can't change it, you can't do anything about it. What you can do is use what you've learned to make better decisions in the future. But you can expend an incredible amount of mental and emotional energy doing the equivalent of kicking yourself over and over and over again for things that you should have known. So this is one of those things that it helps if you're externalizing on paper or talking to someone, checking to see if what you're doing is trying to gather information to make better present and future decisions, or if you're just kicking yourself for something that should have gone better but didn't. It's important when we realize that we are kicking ourselves for a decision we made in the past. That's where the reinterpretation technique we talked about earlier comes into play. Because you can go back to that situation and say, well, I either didn't have all the information, or it was something I needed to try, or there are all sorts of different ways to explain that situation to make you feel better in the present about something that didn't work out, because you didn't have the information or you didn't have the perspective that you have now.
Hindsight bias. Questions for reflection. Do you still feel bad about something that happened in the past, even though you can't change it? Is there anything that you can do to improve the situation instead of continuing to feel bad about it?
Now, the next idea is performance load. And performance load is what happens when you have way too many things to do. So when your to-do list starts reaching hundreds of items long, your performance in all of those tasks decreases. And the more items you are actively working on at a given point in time, the more your performance on all of them decreases. So performance load really means that we have to set limits on what we actively take on if we want to be productive. If we want to be consistently productive every day, having a to-do list of thousands of items long doesn't help us. It actually harms us actively. And this applies to you, and also applies to every single person who works for you. It's incredibly common for managers to keep pushing more and more on the people who report to them without really taking a look at what are all of the things that this person is responsible for doing. And you have to set a limit. The limit on the available work you have to do will not set itself. Never will. And it's not a limit unless there's a consequence. You have to be willing to say, some of these things just aren't going to get done because it's not as important as the other things we need to do. If you don't set the limit, if there is no consequence, it's not really a limit. And so the other thing to think of here is unexpected things in the course of a day happen to us all, particularly if you're working in a larger, more complex organization. So there's a tendency to estimate our available time based on the number of hours in our day, and to book ourselves solid all day, every day, trying to get as much done as possible. What that doesn't account for are all of the unexpected emergencies or things that pop up that you have to deal with. They are both important and urgent, and other things need to fall by the wayside in order to make them happen. But if your day is already scheduled to the gills, and then a situation pops up, now you are on the wrong side of performance load, right? Now everything suffers because now you are suddenly overbooked. So it's important for everybody, whether you're running a company or whether you have employees, making sure there's a certain amount of time that is unscheduled on purpose. And it's not that that time is going to go unfilled. Guaranteed it will be filled. It'll just be filled by things you didn't anticipate when you made your schedule in the first place. So for example, in terms of scheduled work, you can say, I'm not going to schedule any more than, let's say, 6 hours out of an 8-hour workday. You're just saying, of the meetings and the scheduled time I have to work on things, I'm going to schedule 6 hours, and then 2 hours is flex time, or an hour and a half, or whatever threshold you decide to set. And that flex time will always be either taken up with things that you have to deal with right now, or if something doesn't happen, you can always use that for even more productive time on your most important things. But scheduling yourself completely is a recipe to overwhelm yourself very quickly.
80-20 is a beautiful thing.
It is. It really is.
Performance load. Questions for reflection. Are you overburdening yourself or working in an environment that treats overwork as an expectation of the job? What can you do to make your workload more sustainable?
Okay, a couple more ideas. Energy cycles. So because we are biological human beings, we are not robots, we are not automatons, we can't work at maximum capacity 24/7, day after day after day. And what happens biologically is your body goes through cycles of you'll be high energy for a little bit, that'll peak, you'll decline for a little bit, and you'll require a rest, and then that cycle repeats itself. And there's a cycle called the ultradian rhythm. Most of us are familiar with the circadian rhythm, which is our sleeping-waking cycle, right? That's kind of the big cycle. The ultradian cycle is a smaller cycle that happens roughly once every 90 to 120 minutes. Varies a little bit depending on the person. So every 90 to 120 minutes, you'll reach a peak, and then you'll crash a little bit. And then it'll go back up, naturally. So just knowing that you do this, you can probably start to see the pattern in your days. People particularly notice the parts where they feel unmotivated or unproductive, or I need to take a break, or I need to look at something else, or I need to go for a walk, or I need to take a nap. The message here is you can learn your patterns and then plan your work around the times where you are at a peak, and you can plan your rest times around the times where you are naturally in a lull. And James, you do this a lot with your work. Can you talk about that?
From 2:30 until 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I know is a natural time for me when I'm at a low in terms of my energy cycles.
Yep.
So I've got to make sure that all of my most important things are done, and any critical meetings are done before that, and preferably before lunch.
Right. Same thing happens for me for writing. There's a certain time during the day, and it's usually mid-morning and early afternoon. I have about 2 peaks where I am really, really focused, really, really productive. And there are times like around noon or later on in the day where if I sit down at the computer, nothing's going to be done. And so scheduling myself writing time during a lull is just demoralizing because I don't get anything done. I waste a whole lot of time. My body wants to rest, but I'm not letting my body do what it needs to do. So that's really the message here. Schedule your time around your productive up cycles. And when you're in a down cycle, take the opportunity to take a real break. And if you do that, you'll ultimately be far more productive than if you try to push through the lull with caffeine or something else. Plan your MITs during your most productive points and plan the first up energy cycle of your day for all your MITs.
And then understand the flow.
Yes,
Give yourself permission to not be hitting an MIT during the low period.
yes.
And then either pick up your first MIT and your next.
Yes,
up.
and then you're reserving your up cycles for all your MITs until your MITs are done. So that's where it gets to, we were talking about the fivefold how of how do I do this, how do I do this? Okay, I want to write a book. How do I do that? I have to write a bunch of sections. So what's the most important section?
Energy cycles. Questions for reflection. When do you feel most energetic? What times of the day work best to do certain kinds of work? What can you do to manage your energy more effectively during the day?
Okay, similarly to the idea of energy cycles is this idea overall of stress and recovery. So it's helpful to know how much work, how much effort is getting to the point where you are stressed, and stress in terms of, think of it as when you're exercising. You want to push your body to the point where you're going beyond your current limit and kind of stressing your body so it will grow. But when you do that, you have to back off for a little while and let your body recover. And then the next time you stress yourself, you can go a little bit further and a little bit further and a little bit further. This applies to work too. So you want to push yourself just enough that your skills and your abilities are growing, but you also take the time for recovery. So this is one of the themes. There's a really great book by Tony Schwartz called The Power of Full Engagement. The analogy is a business person is a little bit like a sprinter. So there are periods of stress that really need to be followed by periods of recovery, and the recovery part is not slacking. It's not something that is unnecessary. It's something that's really necessary in order to do good work over a long period of time. So if you start to think about your work in terms of stress and recovery cycles, if you go through and you complete a particularly ambitious project, it's perfectly good and indeed a good idea to take a step back and to have a little lull there to allow yourself to recover a little bit before you push. Because if you push and push and push and push, the word most people use for this is burnout. Too much stress, not enough recovery.
Stress and recovery. Questions for reflection. Have you ever reached your breaking point? What did you learn? Are you setting aside enough time for rest and recovery? How can you ensure your productivity expectations are realistic and sustainable?
Now, testing is the act of trying something new. It's a way of applying the iteration cycle to your own life. So testing is this idea, and this is really more of a mindset thing than everything else, combined with the technique, which is looking into your life or looking into your business and finding all of the things that could be made just a little better. And the idea here is you identify an opportunity, and then you just come up with ideas to improve it, and then you just test it. You try it for a little while to collect some information and see if that's a good thing. So as we were talking about earlier, Kelsey and I's vegan experiment for 3 years was a test. We heard about it. There are parts of it that sounded really appealing. It's like, okay, we're just going to jump in and we're going to try it and we're going to see how it goes. You can find really excellent, unexpected ways to improve your life, either by adding something new or, in the absence blindness sense, taking something that was harming you out. And I'll use an example here. Here's a structure to help you find things to test or find things to experiment. The first is observations. So what are you seeing around you? What could potentially be improved? You're just looking into the world and finding opportunities. The second is knowns. What do you already know? What information do you already have about this particular thing that may be pertinent to the test? The third is hypotheses. So what might contribute to what you're seeing? Do you have a theory about what's happening? Tests are based on those theories. What are you going to try? What are you going to start doing or stop doing? Then you implement the test and you figure out the results. What happened? Did it work? Did it change something in a positive way or a negative way? And do you keep doing what you're doing? So here's a tangible example of this. I was observing for, say, about a year that I was sleeping a lot. I was waking up in the morning and I was just feeling exhausted. I was feeling really tired throughout the day. So I would go to bed early and the whole thing would happen again. I would sleep a lot, feel exhausted. I just felt like crap all the time. And I didn't know why. And so I went through my list of known things, like I'm just trying to collect all of this information about what I was doing. And one of the things that we were doing at the time is I was vegan. So that was just a piece of data. I had no idea whether it was related or not. It just was what it was. So hypotheses It's like, okay, what could be happening? What are other things? Do I have a major medical condition that needs to be taken care of? Are there environmental factors that may be involved? You're just coming up with ideas of things that it could be. And one of the hypotheses, I met a lady at a conference who was allergic to wheat gluten, the gluten that's present in wheat, bread, anything that has wheat in it, which is a lot of stuff. And there are all sorts of symptoms for people who have this particular allergy, but her primary symptom was feeling exhausted all the time. It's like, okay, that's another piece of information that I now have, which helped me form one of several hypotheses, which is, well, maybe I have a sensitivity to wheat gluten. So I decided to test this particular hypothesis. We had just moved to Fort Collins. I was setting up an appointment for a physical with a new doctor anyway. So I decided I'm going to test this. I am going to eliminate wheat gluten from my diet. And it was about 3 weeks until I saw my doctor. And the result of that was within those 3 weeks, I felt normal again. I wasn't exhausted. I didn't have a lot of the symptoms that I had. And so I literally typed up a letter, these 5 headings: observations, notes, hypotheses, tests, and results. And I handed it to my doctor. And I say, I want you to do a gluten sensitivity test, which is just simple blood test. As my MD was drawing my blood for the test, he says, I don't care what the test says, because you've already gone through the experimental protocol, and I would recommend that you don't eat wheat. So lo and behold, about a week later, we got the test back, and 2 out of 3 reaction markers for gluten sensitivity were positive. And for me, that was an example of testing the elimination of something, but it followed this particular structure. My favorite thing, there's a restaurant in New York City called Candle Cafe. It's fantastic. My favorite item on the menu there was a Cajun seitan sandwich. And seitan, it has the texture of meat, but it is made from 100% wheat gluten.
And that's with vegans.
Yes.
That's very common. You go buy gluten in a bag.
Yes.
Because it replaces, it's the closely available product
Yes.
to resemble meat and texture. And
I was eating literally gluten sandwiches multiple times a week. And lo and behold, I was feeling horrible. And it wasn't until I observed. But it wasn't until I looked at my life and said, man, I'm feeling really tired all the time. I need to test something because this is not good. That started the whole cycle of going through the process and finding things to test. Because that wasn't the first thing I tested. I tested all sorts of different things, and nothing made a difference until I made the hypothesis, well, maybe this was it, and I tested it. So that's the whole thing. You just look at your life, find things to test, do it over and over again, and you can make a lot of progress.
Testing. Questions for reflection. Are you constantly testing new methods of getting more of what you want and less of what you don't want? How can you make testing and experimentation a part of your daily life?
A couple more ideas in personal productivity. This idea is called mystique. And mystique is the idea that it's easy to like the idea of doing something, and it's very different to like the process of actually doing it, right? So the personal example I use now that I have written a book is that it is easy to like the idea of being a best-selling author. It is a completely different thing to like the process of sitting down every day, button chair, hands on keyboard for months, writing the book, and then doing all the things that need to be done in order to market the book. There's a lot of mystique around the end result, but the process of doing it is very different, and is very different from the image of what most people think of what it is to be an author. But there are some things, so for example, I used to think it would be a really grand thing to be the CEO of a big company someday. It's like, yeah, that sounds like a really attractive thing. And then I put myself in the environment of working for a company in which I was doing the things that needed to be done to get there someday, and I found that the process of actually doing that, I really didn't like at all. It's kind of the same thing of, I brought up James Bond earlier. It's like people like the idea of being this very sophisticated international super spy until they get shot at, right?
Yeah.
But There are certain elements of that job in particular that you can't remove from the process of doing something that has a lot of mystique around it. So my wife, Kelsey, trained as an actress. She can sing, she can dance, she can act. Her goal was to be on Broadway. She moved to New York City. She lived the life of a Broadway actor for a year, which was about 95% waiting tables. And spending just a minuscule amount of time auditioning and performing, and even in the best case of landing a role, understanding that that role was probably going to last for maybe a maximum of 12 weeks, and then she was going to be unemployed again, going back to waiting tables until the next show came around. And so for Kelsey, the mystique was that this was going to be a really good thing, where the actual day-to-day life was not. However, we have a lot of friends, many of whom are performing on Broadway right now. They understand what is necessary, they're willing to do it, they even really like parts of it, and it's worth it because they get to be on stage and that's what they want to do. So it's important to understand, mystique is really powerful. It makes us want things, it makes things look attractive to us. Some of those things actually will be attractive to us, and some of those things, because of absence blindness, we're not going to fully appreciate until we start testing it. So the very best thing that you can do when you're thinking about doing something that looks really attractive is find people who are already doing it and ask a couple of really simple questions, like, what does your day look like? If you had to do it again, would you do that? And do you really enjoy what you're doing right now? And you'll get a lot of super surprising answers. I've talked to a lot of executives at large companies, and I asked them the question, was it worth it? Because they've given up a lot. They've traveled all over the world. They're away from home a large percentage of the time. And as a result, they may not have a super close relationship with their family. And to some people, they couldn't imagine doing anything else. And that was the price of what they wanted. And some people would say it's not worth it. If I could go back and do it again, I would make different decisions with the information that I had now. So mystique is powerful. It affects all of us. The best thing to do is find people who are already doing what we want to do and ask them questions before we go into it. So you want to find what the trade-offs are in advance, if possible.
Mystique. Questions for reflection. How well do you understand the reality and the trade-offs behind what you desire? Are you willing to pay the price for what you want?
A couple more ideas, and then we'll talk about working with other folks. Locus of control is learning to separate what you can directly control or influence from what you can't directly control or influence. Trying to control everything that happens to you is a recipe for disaster and frustration. So the things that you can directly decide to act upon or influence, those are things that you can control. You can control your efforts. You can control your decisions. You can control or influence strongly the environment around you. You can't control other people. You can't control things like the weather. You can't control unexpected circumstances. There are a lot of things in the world that you can't control. And so it's very easy to burn a lot of mental and emotional energy worrying about things that ultimately you don't have any control over, which is the definition of unproductive, right? You can worry all you want. It's not going to help anything. Whereas if those things happen, you can protect yourself against those risks or have those things impact you less by doing things you can control. So the example I used earlier of errors in emission insurance, right? I can't control if later on something unexpected happens, bad things happen, and somebody sues me. I can't control that. What I can control is making a decision now that alleviates the risk of that bad thing becoming catastrophic if it does happen. So locus of control is one of those things that when you learn to focus your energy on what you can influence and let the rest of things go, you start using your time and your energy far more effectively. Because you can notice that you're worrying about something, and you can ask yourself, can I control that thing? And if the answer is no, you can say, well, how can I improve upon it if it does happen? And that gets you back to something that can actually help you. Any good examples of this you can think of?
I can't control the weather, but I can control if I'm going to have an outdoor wedding in the spring.
Yes. Or I can control whether or not I pick up an umbrella on my way out the door today.
You can't control how your book sells.
Exactly. I can't control who reads it, and I can't control what they say in the review section of Amazon.com after they read it. Can't control it.
Can't control the stock market,
Can't control the stock market.
but you control your maybe personal finances.
Can't control your employees. Can't control your customers.
Can't control your brand.
Can't control your brand, right?
Kids.
Or your kids. Or your spouse. But you can do, by how you choose to act, you can influence those things. So that's the major lesson. It's really just a practice of asking yourself, can I really control this? And if the answer is no, what can I do? What do I have control over to make that situation better?
Locus of control. Questions for reflection. What is currently within your influence or control? What is not? Are you focusing on things that are within your locus of control, or are you worrying about things you can't do anything about?
Now, related to locus of control is this idea of attachment. The more attached you are to an idea, or a certain circumstance being exactly the way you want it to, the more you limit your flexibility and reduce your chances of finding a better way. So sometimes we have an idea of how the world is supposed to be that involves elements that are way beyond our control, but we get really attached to that thing happening. And when it doesn't happen, or when something else happens, we get super, super upset, which is also a waste of time and mental and emotional energy, right? So the twists and the turns in life, they're going to happen. Your life is probably not going to turn out exactly the way you imagined to in every single respect without exception. And acceptance is understanding that things can and will change, and when they do change, accepting that they have changed, and then just forming a new plan. So recognizing what happens, letting that past thing go to a certain extent, and then seeing where you are now and forming a new plan. So accept what happened and focus on ways to make it better.
Attachment. Questions for reflection. How attached are you to a certain vision of what you want your life to look like? Are your plans driving you forward, or are they limiting your true options?
Now, another technique, which is super, super useful, and all of you are doing this right now, is what I call personal research and development, personal R&D. So large companies spend billions of dollars every year investing in speculative projects, doing things they don't know whether or not they're going to work. And as a result of making those speculative investments, they come up with new ideas, new techniques, new practices, new products that then go on to make them billions of dollars. Because they budget for it up front, they plan to invest in things that improve their capabilities. And you can take this approach and make it work for you too. So if you have a personal budget or a personal finance planning mechanism, it's really cool when you start setting aside some percentage. So take 5%. 5% of the money that you make, just like you set aside a certain percentage of that for savings, set aside a certain percentage of that for investment in yourself, in your skills or your capabilities or your connections or your experiences. Because when you do that, you start building the skills and capabilities and connections and experiences that will lead to more great things for you down the road. But if you don't invest, you don't get those rewards. So buying things like, if you want to be a graphic designer, buying a tool like Photoshop is a great way to start your personal research and development process, because now you have a tool that you need to learn how to use. And if you invest your time and energy in learning the tool, you're going to be able to do things that you weren't capable of doing before. And as a result, you're going to be able to pitch jobs that you would never have been able to pitch for.
Personal research and development. Questions for reflection. What are you doing to fund your personal research and development account? How are you planning to invest your personal R&D budget?
Now, related to personal R&D is a very important way of thinking about your skills and capabilities as a human being, which is called the growth mindset. And there are really two general ways of looking at the world. One is that the skills and abilities that you possess right now are fixed. They are innate to you. They will never get any better. They will never get any worse. You are genetically determined to have a certain capability at, say, something like math or writing or programming or whatever. Your skills and abilities are fixed. The other way of looking at this is that your skills and abilities are completely malleable. They are not set in stone at all. You may have some natural inclinations, but if you keep working at getting better at something, you will get better at it. It is just a matter of time. And there's a really great book by Dr. Carol Dweck called Mindset that goes into a lot of the research behind this. And they did a series of studies with students. And they primed one set of students to have a fixed mindset. And they primed one set of students to have a growth mindset. And they would give these students some very challenging math tests. And what they found is the students that were primed with the fixed mindset, when they reached the threshold that they weren't able to complete those things easily, they just gave up. It's like, well, I'm not good at that. I'm gonna stop, because if I'm not good at it, why bang my head against the wall? It's never gonna get any better. The students with the growth mindset saw the problem set that they couldn't do yet, and they actually started to get a little bit excited because there was a challenge. And if they worked towards that challenge, they would get better. And if they got better, they would be able to complete it, and they would be able to do ever more difficult things. Because if they applied themselves, if they just worked harder, they were capable of doing it. So StrengthsFinder is an assessment that helps you find some of those natural inclinations, because the counterpoint to this is when we are young, our brains are very malleable, and the connections in our mind that get made and reinforced over time are the things that we tend to be really naturally good at, right? So if you're naturally good at it, you tend to do it more. When you do it more, those neural pathways are strengthened. When we reach a certain point in adulthood, and this happens somewhere between 21 and 25, if I'm remembering the research right, our brain starts to, instead of being this incredibly plastic, very malleable thing, our brain starts to go through a pruning process where we are still able to increase our capabilities if we work, because if we work, those neural pathways get strengthened. It's just a little bit more difficult to do that. And that process of pruning tends to consolidate the really strong connections and prune away some of the weaker ones, which is why we forget about some things that we learned growing up if we no longer do them. So there is such a thing as a natural inclination. So some people are naturally better through this process at some things than other things. But if you practice something, those neural connections will be strengthened. It just may be easier or more difficult for some people to do things than others. It does take a critical threshold of time and effort and practice to get good at something. And the StrengthsFinder approach is designed to be a management approach. So if you have a group of people, you are going to get the most productivity out of those folks if they are working on the things that they are both interested and inclined to do naturally. But personally, in terms of you acquiring the skills, if you want to acquire a new skill and you are interested in the skill and you go through the process of practicing that skill intelligently, you will get better at it. And the StrengthsFinder assessment, it's a very directional thing, right? It can point you in a general direction of things that you might be good at and enjoy doing. But it is not an oracle. It is not a fortune teller. You have choices in all of these things. Yeah, so use it what it's for.
The growth mindset. Questions for reflection. Do you currently think of yourself as having fixed qualities? What can you do to remind yourself that your mind is a muscle that gets stronger with use?